Hey everyone, welcome back to JavaScript Deep Dive. In this episode, we are going to unravel some fundamental concepts in JavaScript like scope, the scope chain, and closures. These concepts are crucial for understanding how JavaScript works. So let's dive right in. First, let's talk about scope. In JavaScript, scope determines the accessibility of variables and functions at different parts of your code. There are three types of scopes in JavaScript: global, local, and block scope. So let's see each of them. So I'm declaring a variable, creating a function over here, and I try to lock the global variable here. And let me call the function, save it. So as I declared it outside the function, it is a global variable, so I can access it even inside the function as well. Let me declare one more variable here and try to access it outside the function. Let's see what happens. You can see the reference error local is not defined just because the variable local is inside the function. So the scope of this local variable is function scope. You cannot access it outside the function. So this is a local variable and this one is a global variable. If you want, you can create one more function and you can access the global variable inside this as well. What if I try to access the local variable here? And let me call the function and let me comment out this one and see when I try to access inside the second one, you can observe console log of global 10 has been printed right here, line number 9. But when I try to access this local inside the second function, which is not accessible, it is showing not defined just because the scope of local is a function scope. You cannot access it outside this function. So if you declare a variable inside a specific function, the scope of the variable is limited to the function only. So coming to the third one, which is a block scope. See, anything inside this is a block. Let's say I am just declaring a variable, let b equals to 20. Console.log of b. You can see here, you can access this one right inside this block. What if I try to access it outside? B is not defined. So this is what we call it as a block scope. When I say block, anything inside the parenthesis. If you observe the difference here, I used var to create these variables, but right here inside this block, I used let keyword. So this block scope will only come into the picture when you declare variables using let and const. So the variables which are created using var will not come under block scope. So these are the three types of scopes available in JavaScript. Now let's move on to scope chain. See, when a variable is not found in the current scope, JavaScript looks up the scope chain to find it. Let me write a function which is outer function and declare a variable and create a nested function. One more function I want to create inside this outer, which I'll call it as inner function. We can name it whatever we want. And right here I want to access variable a, right? And let me call this inner function and then outer function call. What happens in this case? So let me save. You can see 10 has been printed. Here in this case, what I have created is I've created one outer function and inside which I've created one more function which is inner function, which is a nested function I can say, and I just call the inner function. And if you observe, I try to access a variable a which is not inside the scope of the inner function. The a is actually inside the scope of outer function. So in this specific case, how the execution will happen, let's see that. See, from previous videos, as you already know, while the execution is happening, as the outer function call has been made, for the outer function execution context would be created, right? So inside the outer function, as we have a variable and a function, for variable a, undefined would be allocated, and then for the function, the complete function would be stored, right? That's how first one execution context would be created. And then moving on to the second function, whenever we have a second function call right over here, one more execution context would be created for this function as well, which is inner function, right? So inside the inner function, again in the memory allocation phase, actually if you see, there is nothing here, there is no variable or a function inside it. So execution will happen. So in the execution, it will encounter the line console.log of a. So in this specific function, there is no variable a. That means at the memory allocation phase, in the execution context of the inner function, there is no variable called a, right? So it will look for its parent scope. So outer function is a parent for inner function, right? Just because this a is not available in the scope of inner function, it will look for its parent scope, that is outer function. So as you know, in the outer function we have a variable a and the value is 10. Just because the variable a is available in its parent scope, that's a reason why you will see the output as 10. So the process of looking for its outer function scope when the variable is specifically not available in its own scope is nothing but a scope chain. What if the variable is not even available right over here? Let me remove this. Try to add it right here. What is the difference? If you observe, the output is same. So in this case, first it will look right here. Just because inner function doesn't have the variable a, it will look for its parent scope. The parent is outer function, and even in the parent scope there is no variable called a. That it will look inside the global scope. So inside the global scope we have a variable a and the value is 10. That's the reason we see this out. Hope you're clear with the scope and scope chain in JavaScript. Finally, let's dive into closures. A closure is created when a function is defined inside another function, allowing the inner function to access variables from the outer function scope even after the outer function has returned. We can even return this function. So it is a valid JavaScript code. I just returned this inner function inside the outer function, right? So as I return this inner function, as the outer function call is right over here, the inner function would be returned right here. Let me add a variable here, closure, let's say, and try to log this. Now see. So the inner function has been returned. Now let me call this function. See, this is nothing but a closure. Let's see what I mean by that. Coming to the execution, just because the inner function is trying to access console log, it will look for the outer function scope and then into the global scope. That's what we discussed as a scope chain. Just because of the scope chain, the closures would be formed. See, in this specific case, if you observe, the execution of this outer function has been completed at line number 7. So as soon as the execution is completed, you know that the execution context will be vanished for the specific function, right? So in that particular case, when I try to call the function at line number 9, but still there is access to the variable a, that's the reason it is printed value 10. How is this possible? As you try to return this one outside the function and try to access it, it forms a closure. Here the first thing is, you try to access a variable which is not inside the function, and you even return this outside the function. So that's when closures will be formed. Remember, not every function in JavaScript forms a closure. Just because you are trying to access a variable which is not in the scope of the function, and also you return the function outside the function scope, that's the reason it forms a closure. So what is meant by a closure now? A function with local memory along with the lexical parent is nothing but a closure. Let's see this in action. So you can see A is inside the global scope. You can see here closure. The inner function has formed a closure. This inner function will have access to its outer function and the global functions variables as well. Just because it is having access to this global as well, it could able to access it even after the completion of the stack. That's it for today's episode. I hope you now have better understanding of scope, the scope chain and closures in Java. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated with the latest episodes. Happy coding and see you next time.